Welcome, everyone. This is our first photo talk for 2024. And the next one would have been in here, but it can't be. So it's been postponed until September. So the newsletter that I sent out has got a wrong date for the second one. The newsletter that I sent out also had a wrong date for today. So I corrected that with interesting typographic information. Sorry, I was trying to do too many things at once. So, welcome. I'm Amanda Vojtovic, President of Friends of the Allport, and if you're not a member, there are brochures at the door going out, and you could join us. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Muanina, who have never ceded their land, and I would like to pay respect to their elders, past and present, particularly anybody who may be in this audience. Now, I'm introducing Anita Gowers. Anita is doing a PhD. She's a PhD candidate at ANU in the Centre for Art History and Art Theory, and she's actually researching the picture framing history. She graduated already with an MPhil from the University of Queensland, and she's worked in higher education for some time across a range of disciplines. Most recently, the position of Strategic Research Manager at the Creative Exchange Institute at the University of Tasmania, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. Her presentation today is exploring the evolution and contrast of art display methodologies in the 19th century in Britain and Australia, focusing on the divergence between public and private exhibition spaces. I think this is going to be great. It initiates with an in-depth look at the exhibition hang technique, a hallmark of the Royal Academy, as the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in London. And I was just learning on the way in about the Royal Academy line, which I knew nothing about. So I'm intensely looking forward to Anita's presentation. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you very much. And I would like to say I've made the trifecta with Amanda because the date on my presentation is also incorrect. So there was something in the universe. I would like to thank all of you for being here because I know that everyone is busy and you have a lot of things on. And the fact that you're all choosing to be here in this wonderful space of the Allport is marvellous, and I'm very grateful. I'd also like to thank Caitlin and the Allport for inviting me to speak today because this is truly one of my favourite galleries, and we are incredibly lucky here in Hobart to have the Allport. So today I'm going to briefly outline some of the transformations that occurred leading up to and during the 19th century. I'm going to discuss the display of art and discuss how it came about, and then look at the display of art within the home in broad terms and finish with some discussions about the display of art in Hobart Town in 1830s and 40s. So the 19th century was a period of profound transformation. It was marked by significant shifts in social, political, economic and artistic spheres. This era witnessed the rise of industrialisation with the mechanisation of production, where newly invented machines, driven by new sources of energy, which was water, steam, electricity, oil. These machines produced goods of all sorts faster and for far less than previously, leading to unprecedented economic growth. Enormous social changes also occurred, which included the significant movement of people from farms and small rural areas to communities with larger towns and cities with factories, as we can see here. What occurred was there were horrific working conditions, long hours, low wages, and child labour. The combination of these large number of workers and the working conditions led workers to organise into labour unions, Politically, these labour unions formed trade unions, which emerged and promoted new ideologies that challenged existing power structures. And from the 1870s, there were further changes with the introduction of electricity, mass power production, transportation with rail, steamships, the shift from coal to oil, and communication also developed rapidly with the introduction of the telegraph and later the telephone. So this is only the broadest description of terms to indicate the amount of changes that occurred during the 19th century to the social, political, economic aspects. Because during the 19th century, there was also a significant shift in the display of art. So to understand the changes in the display of art, we actually need to go back to the 18th century, because the English art market in the 18th century witnessed enormous growth in the consumption of art. And that came about because of concurrent cultural events. There was an increase in the buying of art and the ownership of art, and it was influenced by several phenomena. One of those was the cult of collecting. The emergence of the art dealer as a profession, the increasing role of the press in disseminating information about art, and the increased opportunities for the public to view art through exhibitions. All of these factors made London the centre for the consumption of art in the Western world. This slide here shows Boughton Hall that was owned by the Dukes of Montagu. What occurred with the collection of art was that started in the 17th century and culminated at its zenith in the 19th century. But this feverishly collecting of all sorts of things became an intergenerational pursuit. At Boughton House, shown here in Northamptonshire, the Dukes of Montagu began collecting art in 1683. At the time, they possessed 17 artworks. By 1832, it had ballooned to 269 artworks. And as you can see, none of them were small works of art. So it was these private homes that littered the English countryside that were open by appointment only and only to recommended travellers to view the artworks in these picture collections. And that was one of the very few ways and the beginning of the public being able to view art. Because what had happened was England had emerged from the wars of Louis XIV as the richest country in the world. The aristocracy were a bit tired of their staid constitutional monarchy and began to seek the excitement of the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. And one of the striking features of British collecting was the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour was the habit of travelling to Italy, usually via the Low Countries and France, and it developed in the late 1700s and became a rite of passage for wealthy young men in the 18th century, so they could acquire taste, culture, and experiences. So it was in Italy where Englishmen, their artists, as well as men of learning, mingled and absorbed art and architecture. And here, this slide shows a collection by John Cecil, the 5th Earl of Exeter, whose collection remains at Burghley House, along with his wife, Anne Cavendish, who was the daughter of the 3rd Earl of Devonshire. They sailed in 1679 on a private yacht with 22 servants to Lucca, Padua, Florence, and Rome. And during their travels, they purchased 2 enormous works by Luca di Giordano, The Rape of Europe and The Death of Seneca in the top right. They commissioned a further 13 works from the artist. So as the wealthy travelled on this grand tour, they collected art and artefacts. And when they returned, they needed places to display their picture collections. So the grand homes and houses of London were renovated to include picture salons for the specific purpose of displaying collections. In 1805, Thomas Lister Parker remodelled Brownslow Hall in Yorkshire, adding a new drawing room which was 30 feet by 24 feet to serve as the gallery for his picture collection. In 1806, Sir George Beaumont and Lady Beaumont purchased their London abode in Grosvenor Place and added a new picture gallery to accommodate their growing collection of old masters. And we can see this is an engraving of Grosvenor Gallery, of which the Queen and Prince Albert were visiting, giving the royal seal approval, and it was widely published. Another example with an obsession of all things neoclassical, was Thomas Hope, who was an interior designer, author, art collector, and the son of a very wealthy banker. He promoted Greek revival architecture within the home, and this is a drawing from his 1807 publication titled Household Furniture and Interior Decoration. One of the things that's really interesting is that he covered the walls in curtains to protect the art. So if you popped in and there were no staff available, you couldn't see the art because they couldn't draw the curtains. He opened his London home to a select group of public. In fact, Thomas Hope's home was one of the few that was included in the 1802 upmarket guidebook to London, which listed the private art galleries that were open for appointment only. See if we can do it this way. Of course, the royals, not to be left behind, were part of this process. In 1850, Prince Albert supervised the redecoration of the Royal Picture Gallery at Buckingham Palace, and he introduced the colour lilac onto the walls. On the left is a work by Douglas Moran from 1843, showing the picture gallery at Buckingham House, and on the right is a work by Lewis Haig, which represents the christening of Prince Leopold and shows the lilac walls. The redecoration coincided with a rehang of the paintings, and the Prince commissioned 185 new frames for the paintings in the picture gallery. Whilst this is my area of research, it was actually astounding because he selected reverse section frames in the Louis XIV style. It had repeating folate ornament, but the reason why I mention these frames is because it reduced the shadows cast by the previous deep Regency frames that have been preferred by George IV. What it also did by having every single frame on these 185 works, it gave the gallery a unified appearance. So the early picture galleries in England essentially came about from private collectors. A limited number of people could access them. So the opportunities to see art for the broader public, what options did they have? They had the church, but all of those were religious. There were limited opportunities. There were also limited opportunities for artists to display their work until the Royal Academy. So the official art institutions played a pivotal role in shaping the display of public taste in the 19th century artworks. The most significant professional art societies in Europe at the period were the Royal Academies in France and England, established in 1648 and 1768 respectively. These institutions were not just schools of instruction, but they were venues where artists could display their work and cultivate potential clients through their annual exhibitions. And from the late 18th century, these institutions had a virtual monopoly on public taste of the display of art, as well as official patronage. Established on the 10th of December 1768, under the patronage of George III, the Royal Academy, displayed here in 1771, had a profound influence on the display of art. The Academy's purpose was twofold. It was to instruct artists and to exhibit artworks. The first students admitted in 1769, and in the same month, the directors established rules for the inaugural exhibition, which was to be held between the 26th of April and the 27th of May in 1769 in small rented rooms just off Pall Mall, which was a fashionable district of London. And this is when the Academy was still in Pall Mall. This work is very well known as Designed and Etched by Thomas Rawlinson from his Microcosms of London. One of the rules of the 5 rules that the directors established was rule number 4. And it states, no picture to be received without a frame. This rule was also included in the widely circulated announcement inviting artists to exhibit. What it did was to establish, from the very first exhibition of the Royal Academy, it mandated that works had to be, for them to be accepted, they had to be framed. This seemingly simple requirement had a profound influence on the display of art because it shaped the public perception for literally much of the 19th century. And you can see the hang. This one is by George Cruikshank from 1821, and it's called Tom and Jerry at the Exhibition of Pictures at the Royal Academy. Although the Royal Academy of Arts was the preeminent exhibiting institution, it was not the sole organisation promoting art in London. Other institutions promoting art at the same time were the Royal Watercolour Society, established in 1804, the British Institution, 1805, and the Royal Society of British Artists, established in 1823. This is another image from the Royal Academy, and you can see again this influence of frames hanging cheek by jowl, known as the exhibition hang. All of the institutions that I just mentioned replicated the hanging process of the Royal Academy and the requirement that works had to be framed. Now, this image depicts the Watercolour Society from 1808. And I can imagine all of you had automatically assumed that these were works on canvas. John Glover, who came to Tasmania, was in fact the president of the Watercolour Society in 1807 and 1808. And this was the time when watercolour artists were trying to raise the profile of watercolours, because at the time, the Royal Society popped them into a little room on the side, and they did not have financial parity. So watercolourists decided to frame their works using larger pieces of paper and to bring the frame right to the edge of the image. So hopefully people would be mistaken that it could be an oil and pay more. So the influence of the Royal Academy was notable. The British institution adopted the same regulations for exhibitors, and the Regulation 3 required all pictures had to be framed. They had the additional requirement that they had to be gilt frames, adding significant cost to the artists. These organisations maintained the Royal Academy's hang and hung artworks, cheek by jowl, floor to ceiling. So what we can see is the influence of the Royal Academy's requirement and hanging style was amplified. So to understand the importance of the Royal Academy exhibition, we can look not just at the number of works displayed, but rather the number of framed artworks submitted to the selection committee each year. The Royal Academy only began recording this total number of works in the mid-19th century. In 1789, 6,416 works were submitted for selection and only 1,586 were displayed. In 1887, 8,686 were submitted, 1,946 were displayed. 9 years later, in the blockbuster exhibition of 1896, 12,408 works were submitted and only 1,900 were exhibited. So the volume of artwork submitted was enormous. What was also enormous was the number of picture frames that were made for every single one of those artworks. So what this slide displays is, with the rise of the press in the mid-1900s, was the difference in perception between the respectable visitors to the Royal Academy and the opening up of art exhibitions to the general public. But up until the late 1830s, the display of art essentially resembled public houses. However, after the completion of the new purpose-built National Gallery in Trafalgar Square, experts argued that a public gallery should no longer look like a private house, because artworks which were once confined to the exclusive audiences were now open to the public, and the spaces need to reflect that. This image here is the National Gallery as it was housed in John Julius Angerstein's home, which the government bought in 1824. And the foreign press ridiculed England for this space because it compared unfavourably to the Louvre. It forced the English government to build a new gallery in 1838. So it was only later, through the successes of the privately run British institutions and their annual exhibitions, which allowed leading collectors to close their houses because they could now lend their works without having to open up their private spaces. It became known as the loan exhibition, and a staple event in the modern art world was invented. It also helped overcome the awkwardness of having public walking through your house. By the mid-19th century, the traditional academies were being challenged by artists and the avant-garde movement. Some of the artists sought to change from within, exhibiting radical works at these official venues, and John Ruskin went further, arguing, in fact, that the hanging was unacceptable and that all painting should be hung in a single row, allowing the viewer to have a separate experience of each artwork. And it took quite a few more decades before that was to become practice. Nevertheless, despite all of these breakaway galleries and exhibitions and new artist movements that were emerging, the Royal Academy was directly and indirectly instrumental for the shaping of public taste in the display of art. This image is of the Great Exhibition in 1851. Another exhibition style that blew up in the 19th century was the Great Exhibition. These exhibitions were on an exponentially larger scale. The emergence of the International Exhibition in the second half of the 19th century had a profound influence on the public's perception of the display of public art. These exhibitions, and world fairs dominated the cultural scene and provided nations with the opportunity to demonstrate their artistic, technical, and scientific ingenuity. These exhibitions also supported a broader civilising mission through their juxtaposition of world cultures, their encouragement of trade relations, and their promotions of advances in manufacturing and industry, and the promotion of art. They served as gigantic instruments of education and refinement, and what they all did was copy the Royal Academy because every artwork had to be framed. What we can see in this slide from the Illustrated London News is new agricultural workers. The exhibitions opened up access to art to the public. And as they proliferated throughout Britain in the second half of the 19th century, the public got to see both art and manufacturing on an unprecedented scale. In London, there was a series of smaller exhibitions in 1847, 48, 49, with visitor numbers in the tens of thousands. And then, of course, there was the blockbuster, the Great Exhibition of 1851, held from the 1st of May to the 15th of October. It included thousands of artworks and welcomed a staggering 6 million people. It was the first time the public could view thousands of artworks, and it served as a catalyst for the future international exhibitions. And it also inspired the establishment of museums and cultural institutions. It was followed by things like the Dublin Exhibition in 1852, the 1862 London International Exhibition, as well as one of the most awe-inspiring, the International Exhibition in Paris in 1889. So all of these exhibitions attracted people from all over, and attending one of them, the members were bombarded by artworks and frames of every shape, every size, and every finish. At the time, the exhibitions were widely covered in the press, which fed to the public interest in art. And the increase in public interest was reflected in the circulation figures. In 1839, the Art Journal's monthly circulation was 700. In 1850, it had reached 8,000. By 1851, it was probably something Murdoch would be pleased with, it was over 25,000. So the constant press coverage of the many exhibitions also contributed to this interest in art and helped drive the consumption of artworks. And this image is from an art auction in 1861, showing the fervour about the need to purchase an artwork. It's like the Maya sale at Christmas. So in summary, the emergence of the international exhibition in the second half of the 19th century influenced the display of art by providing a global platform for artistic achievements and public taste that was all influenced by the Royal Academy of Art. So having explored the theme of public art, let's now shift to private sphere and paintings, because artworks in a home setting encompass a wide array of works, the majority of which are never going to make it to a gallery. So this leads us to ask the question, is a domestic picture merely a diminished version of the public gallery counterpart, or does it somehow contribute more significantly to the identity of the home? Could it possibly serve as a means of articulating the spaces within the home and establishing connections with the world beyond? This is a range of engravings from the 19th century showing interiors, all with women and all with artworks in the background, because the 19th century saw the democratisation of art, with a display of art and picture hanging extending to the middle classes. In 1837, Leigh Hunt, the English art critic, journalist and leading intellectual, wrote, "May we extort such of our readers as have no pictures hanging in their room to put up one immediately." Hunt wrote an article called "Put Up a Picture in Your Room," and that was much reproduced throughout the Victorian age, in particular in women's magazines. Hunt's article was also included in a book that accompanied the vast art treasures exhibition of 1857. His article was adopted by everyone. The picture culture perceived by Victorians was that putting up an artwork was a good thing and necessary in the home. So during the first half of the 19th century, artworks, interestingly, were present across every single level of the London art market. And this phenomenon was explored by the renowned English journalist and social researcher Henry Mayhew in his groundbreaking work titled London Labour and the London Poor. Mayhew detailed the widespread presence of street sellers of picture frames who sold frame pictures at evening markets or under the arm. He recorded the strategies that these frame picturers used to attract potential buyers, and they used vocal appeals such as, "Who would be without an ornament in his dwelling?" Furthermore, Mayhew documented the unique verbal shorthand of the swag barrowmen, and they were the people who walked up and down London alleyways with a wheelbarrow. What they shouted loudly to indicate they had artworks for sale was frames. So the existence of artworks described at what can be best, the very bottom of the London art market, indicates that they weren't just luxury accessories exclusive to the upper echelons. And this is an image of Dante, the artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti, in his drawing room in 1882. And you will notice the dark green walls, which are replicated here in the back room of the Allborn. So during the 19th century, the Victorian domestic interiors evolved beyond mere functionality, transforming carefully curated spaces that mirrored the social and cultural aspirations of their inhabitants. So with the exponential increase in domestic goods that were available in the 19th century to an ever-increasing number of people, there was a growing interest in domestic aesthetism, and household advice manuals surfaced, guiding the socially conscious consumers through the bewildering assortment of available furnishings. One of those early books was Thomas Hope's in 1807, which I've mentioned previously, because his book helped invent the idea of the interior as a work of art. These art manuals dictated what to buy and, more importantly, what not to buy. And a prime example of this phenomenon was Charles Eastlake's Hints on Household Taste, published in 1868. And the book served as a guide for aspiring middle classes. Eastlake, a distinguished architect and furniture designer, positioned himself as the judge of Victorian taste, and he meticulously dictated correct choices for all aspects of domestic living, from selecting cutlery to curtains. Eastlake prescribed specific instructions on the placement of artworks in the home. Oil paintings deserve their own dedicated space. Family portraits should be enclosed in massive frames, particularly if you are fond of someone. Then they should not be hung in the dining room. Eastlake's emphasis on the frame, its materials and spatial arrangement underscores the importance of the frame as an object within his ideal Victorian home. In fact, he dedicated an entire chapter to what he called wall furniture, emphasising the importance of the relationship between the artwork and the frame, because he saw frames not merely as functional elements, but as aesthetic borders that directed the viewer's gaze. He even went to the granular detail of the materiality of frames. He criticised composition ornament as a new, ugly technique that had replaced traditional wood carving. He deemed compo frames so brittle that instead of protecting the picture, they need to be handled more carefully than glass itself. He dismissed the overmantel mirror as a bad style of work and declared that if anyone placed one there, they should be ashamed. His lamentation over the decline of craftsmanship across all areas reflected his adherence to traditional values of authenticity, which he believed were essential to the well-appointed Victorian home. So, in his ideal of the Victorian home, there are a plethora of works on the artworks, and we can see this here in this photograph. What was soon to revolutionise the display of work was the picture rail. because it became a necessity, in particular, to avoid the lath and plaster walls becoming like Swiss cheese. And they became a popular feature within Victorian homes, allowing homeowners to display their art collections. So the symbolism conveyed by the domestic Victorian interior was just as important as its functionality to the inhabitants. Objects represented far more than their physical form. They became symbols of intangible values. The interior furnishings reflected the inhabitants' morality, hopefully good, and social standing, hopefully getting better. So appropriate furnishings were the physical manifestations of refinement, both personal and familial. The arrangement of objects in domestic interiors, as prescribed by these household handbooks, provides us a lens through which to understand the broader Victorian preoccupation with domestic symbolism, influencing the aspirational middle classes. Now here is an image of it. We've moved across continents to the edge of the empire here in Australia, and this is a work that was taken from Terry Lane and Jessie Searle's book, A Squatter's Hut. And what you can see in this image is framed artworks with gilt frames. 1830s Hobart Town framed artworks were only to be able to see either in churches or in homes. So the Vandemonians were particularly keen for their domestic interiors to be read as English by the new British settlers. Many Hobartians replicated Victorian interior trends in their homes, even though they're on the other side of the world. And the relative uniformity between Victorian interiors in Britain and those in the colonies was observed by the artist John Skinner Prout, who visited Van Diemen's Land in January 1844. And he wrote, "Much as I have been delighted on my arrival in Port Jackson with the varied beauty of the harbour, I must confess my surprise was increased when observing how considerable a taste for the elegancies of life was manifested in the fittings and furniture of a better class of residents. The walls of many were hung with paintings of varying merit, but on the whole, just as one would likely to meet in similar establishments in England." Of course, this in many instances was attributable to the circumstance of the person having brought their household goods with them, and in the houses of the lower class, the love of ornament was equally perceptible. Prout's observation, favourably comparing colonial domestic interiors to London's, was high praise indeed. One individual who arrived with a remarkable amount of goods and furniture was Bishop Francis Russell Nixon, the first Anglican bishop of Van Diemen's Land. Bishop Nixon sailed into Hobart in 1843 with his wife, 5 children, 3 servants, and 52 cases of worldly possessions. The considerable number of domestic necessities ensured Prout, as astutely observed by Prout, the English domestic standards could be upheld. Anna Maria Nixon, the bishop's wife, was an avid letter writer, and she proudly states to her father, "Everyone compliments me on my English-looking household." And on the 5th of July 1844, she explains why they had specifically brought one of their servants with them from England. Their manservant, John Richard Bailey, had travelled with them for the express purpose of making furniture, and everything he puts his hand to is in the best English style. When her dining room was finished the following year, she wrote, "It is considerably improved. Bailey has made a beautiful hue and pine frame for the artwork. It's placed over a hue and pine bookcase, and we have 2 of Prout's best watercolour views, old drawings of Varleys and Turners, of which the bishop has had framed for an exhibition. We have 27 prints and drawings in our dining room." The abundance of framed artworks in Nixon's drawing room underscores the importance and significance within the context of the domestic interior. And Anna Maria's descriptions vividly convey the emphasis placed on new replicating English standards. This image here is by S.T. Gill in 1857 of Monsieur Nuflard's house in Sydney. And again, you can see the importance of the artwork to the interior. So the similarities commented on by Prout between colonial and English interiors are also reflected in contemporary literature. In the 1859 novel, The Broad Arrow, Bridget, one of the characters, reads aloud, "The accepted rules of polite society in Tasmanian, or indeed Australian life. Rule number 4, never apply the term colonial to anything but produce. Example, never say of any domestic arrangement, it's so colonial. Reason, all colonists aspire to English thoughts, manners, and habits." Bridget explains that under the same rule, a lordly squatter who was showing his home to a stranger stated, "My place is so English, you'll think yourself at home. There, sir, isn't that English?" So both Anna Maria's description of her interiors and Bridget's explanation of how to compliment a Tasmanian emphasises the importance of Victorian domestic cultural codes to the aspirational white British settlers. And this is Mary Morton's drawing room from 1861. So replicating Victorian interiors was in part achieved with the assistance of English household manuals that travelled to the colonies because they were considered an essential domestic item. In 1823, John Leake arrived in Van Diemen's Land with his family and merchandise worth £3,000. He was granted 2,000 acres, established a lucrative wool and wheat export business. Among his surviving domestic possessions included a signed copy of Practical Economy or the Application of Modern Discoveries to the Purpose of Domestic Life from 1821, which was a manual offering economic advice on various aspects of running a household. Notably, it includes tips on how to clean and look after your artwork. The cleaning of artworks was left to those who make it a profession, while frames could be cleaned by the homeowner. And this is where I put a caveat. Do not try this at home, because the suggested method of cleaning the frame was to use a soft brush. Once it was wet, keep brushing. And the frame then needs to be dried. Place it near the fire, after which you need to polish the gilding with a brush that's dipped in powder of bread charcoal. These specific instructions on cleaning the gilded picture frames emphasises, alongside their artwork, their importance within the domestic interior. So the similarity between London and Van Diemen's Land is a remarkable transnational feat of colonial continuity. It reassured the newly arrived English visitor of the moral decency and social standing of the colonial residents. The transnational domestic consistency was reinforced by these household manuals with their descriptions and prescriptions of domestic interiors, and it played a central role in ensuring continuity of the Victorian domestic standards throughout the colonies. The shared interior language created a transnational identity among the Anglophone middle classes that started with the Royal Academy in 1769. So in conclusion, the seemingly inconsequential rule number 4 established by the Royal Academy set the standard for the display of art that lasted for most of the 19th century. The rise of public museums and galleries also played a significant role in the transformation of the display of art. Public galleries and museums democratise the viewing of and access to art. And this shift not only changed the way art was consumed, but also influenced its creation, with artists responding to and reflecting to the changing world around them. Thus, the 19th century can be seen as a pivotal period that reshaped the private and public lives of art. Thank you. This is one of my favourite works. It's by Banksy. Any questions?
There'll be questions. Yes.
This one's off on a little bit of a tangent, but I'm wondering to what extent you've considered in that whole area of the democratisation of art, the role of new technologies coming in for reproduction, because obviously if you're down at towards the bottom end of the social scale, you know, what you can actually probably afford to purchase are going to be reproductions of art.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the conditions of the Royal Academy is that there were no copies allowed, and that actually permeated all the other institutions. You're right, there was a mass of engravings that occurred, reproductions of images. You had the advent of the daguerreotype in 1847, the production of photography. They all influenced, and that's why within those domestic spheres, there was a whole menagerie of different types of images, materials, etc. Absolutely. Yep. Pretty cool. Thank you. Great question.
Questions, comments? I really loved your potted history at the beginning.
Can I comment and suggest that the Allport book you up for a talk about framing, because I think that's the next story that is in your.
I'll talk to a chair leg about picture framing. Well, the Allport has an amazing range of original frames. These two out here, these hue and pine ones, are by Robin Loynhood, and they're exquisite. Tony Brown's not here, is he? Oh, because he'd be able to tell you.
Some of it's come back. I used to be a guide at Runnymede, and some of the huge family descendants, because there's a lot of them, one was returned about 5 or 10 years ago, which are the original portraits of Bishop Nixon and his wife that were done before he left.
Oh, were they at Runnymede?
Yes. In their, what they call the study, I don't know what they call it now.
Oh, fabulous. And did you hear that?
That's Runnymede.
Runnymede's the House of Newtown, is Bay Road.
Oh, okay.
It's National Trust.
Oh, okay.
And it's got a lot of Bishop Nixon stuff in it. But these two portraits came by a fortuitous route via America and Italy.
Oh, wow.
I just got this vision of those artworks on phones as well. Shit.
Well, no, and it's really interesting because John Glover, when he turned up in 1831, there were no professional framers in Hobart. They didn't turn up till 1833, which is George Henry Peck. But John Glover actually sent 2 fancy wood frames to London, and that went across with Sir Alfred Stevens. So just think of the size of the crate, because Glover made quite big works, to go on a very long sea voyage that was really wet and not ideal. So, you know, just the expense and size of having to crate framed works. And in the legislative chamber, there's an enormous copy of a Winterhouse, a portrait of Victoria, and that actually came out in the original's about 2 metres, I think, and this one is 4 metres by just over 2 metres. It came out in a metal tin box. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? 23 karat gold, it's phenomenal. Yeah.
Can I add something, please? These frames aren't original for the 2 Nixon portraits. because they were rolled up and did several sea voyages across the Pacific.
Mm. Well, and that also, there was a lot of complaints by, in particular, some of the Impressionists in the late sort of early 1880s and onwards, is because there was a large tax on artworks that influenced bringing artworks back. So although Australian artists were painting in Europe, it was costly to bring them back.
Which I think was criminal.
Well, there was no tax on the frame, so I don't mind. Sorry.
Which is why Lily Alport had one hidden behind.
Yes,
the
yes.
corridor.
Yeah.
She got 2 paintings in one frame,
Correct.
bringing it back in 1922.
Yeah, so when you walk out here on the right-hand side, you'll see the frames that look like the timber's very rough. It's raw sawn timber, and they gilded straight onto the timber, which was a very different style and came about around the change of art. So they're no longer using gesso to seal the timber, which gives the substrate that you can then apply bowl to for gilding. So it's a really interesting, and it reflects the light quite differently.
Definitely a framing talk.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is probably going to end up being for your framing talk, but can you just give us like very, very quick little potted? I mean, were framers, was it a family business? Was it handed down from father to son? How did someone get into being a framer?
In colonial Australia,
Yes.
generally they pinch some stuff in England, and they were highly skilled. So what's really interesting is there was a range of Italian workers from around Como that went to London to work in the silver trade. They pinched stuff, got caught, and they were sent out to Van Diemen's Land or Sydney Cove. So I've done the research around the early convicts with the skill of carver and gilder, gold beater exception that ended up turning up here, because we had an enormous number of furniture made at the King's Yard. And what was really interesting recently with the fabulous Jane Stewart, I was looking at the conservation documentation around Benjamin Deterra's The Conciliation. And on the back of it, there is the broad arrow. So I haven't started researching that, which to me is remarkable that we have Benjamin Deterra picturing Robinson with First Nations people and a frame potentially made by convict labour. Yeah, so to answer your question directly, all of them learned their skill in London. Bailey, who came out with the Nixons, was a highly skilled craftsman, and there were only several that lasted into generation. The Hoods was one of them. They were in business for 68 years. Gregory Peck didn't. William Wilson in Launceston, his son took over his business, didn't last long, went and bought a pub. I think all of that was also dependent on the economic fluctuations that occurred. So 1830s and 40s in Tasmania was the beginning of the art ecosystem of Australia. You had ex-convict artists and free artists arrive, as well as the travelling artists like Skinner Prout. You had Frederick Strange, Henry Mundy, Thomas Griffith Wainwright, Thomas Bok, like an enormous number of artists. And you had wealthy people who are interested in art. You had the Franklins, Sir Lady, what's her name? Sir and Lady Franklin. You had the Nixons. You had the Allports, who were hugely influential in supporting this art ecosystem. And that's how I think those, because Robin Lloyd Bourne, the dad who turned up, he actually listed his skill as carpenter. 3 years later, he became a carver and gilder and opened his picture framing manufactory. And he had the cheek to call his place Somerset House after the Royal Academy. Not cheek, he was really good at what he did.
Well, Anita, fabulous.
Oh, so